The courtroom was small, quiet, and almost too still. The only sound was the faint rustling of papers, the soft shuffle of feet across the floor. It was a place where people came to seek justice, but today, the atmosphere felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something unusual might happen. At the front of the room stood the judge, a man in his late 60s, with a reputation for being fair, but also firm. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, always looking for the truth. He had seen many cases in his time, from the most minor offenses to the most serious crimes. But today, he seemed deep in thought, glancing over his notes, waiting for the next case to begin. Then, the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, looking out of place in the elegant room. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world rested on them. He looked at the judge, then at the floor, clearly nervous. This man wasn't like the others, who had come through these doors. There was something about him that made the judge take notice, something that told him this case would not be like the others. The man stepped up to the podium, his hands shaking slightly. He tried to steady himself, but the nervousness was clear in his voice as he spoke. "Your Honor, I didn't mean to do it," he stammered. "I know I broke the law, but it wasn't intentional." The judge listened closely, not interrupting. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on the man. He explained how he had been in a hurry, rushing to get to work, and accidentally parked in a restricted area. He never meant to break the rules, but the fine had come anyway. "It's just a small mistake," the man said, his voice pleading. "I can't afford to pay the fine. I've barely got enough for food, let alone this." There was a pause, as the judge considered the man's words. The fine was small by some standards, but to this man, it was a mountain he couldn't climb. He had nothing left after paying for the basics, and now this. The courtroom was quiet, as the judge turned his gaze from the man's pleading eyes to the paperwork in front of him. The fine was set, and the rules were clear. But something about the way the man spoke made the judge pause. He could tell that this wasn't just another case. The man wasn't trying to get out of paying, he was just asking for understanding. The judge's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man, his mind working. As the man stood there, looking down at the floor, his mind drifted back to the life that had brought him here. He thought of the long hours spent working at a small, cramped warehouse, stacking boxes and sorting goods. His boss paid him just enough to get by, and barely more. It was exhausting work, but it kept a roof over his head and food on the table. At home, his wife and children depended on him. Every day was a battle to make ends meet. There were bills to pay, rent to cover, and groceries to buy. And always there was the worry, hanging like a cloud, that he wouldn't make enough that month. He didn't have the luxury of saving up for emergencies. Every penny was accounted for, and even then, there wasn't always enough. His wife worked too, but her job didn't pay much either. Together they made it, just barely. But every time something unexpected came up, it was a blow. This fine felt like one of those blows. The man thought about his children. They were young, full of hope, but they didn't understand the constant strain. They saw their father as someone who could fix things, but he couldn't fix this. He couldn't pay the fine. He swallowed hard. How was he supposed to explain this to his family? How would he tell them he failed, that he couldn't even pay a small fine? The judge continued to watch him. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. The man shifted on his feet, the weight of his situation growing heavier by the second. The room remained quiet, the only sound coming from the judge as he shuffled the papers in front of him. Everyone waited, unsure of what would happen next. The man stood there, barely breathing, eyes cast down, still unsure how to make the judge see his side. Then, the judge did something unexpected. He leaned forward slightly, the creak of his chair filling the silence. "Mr. Thomas," the judge said, his voice calm but firm, "I've heard your explanation, and I believe you, but the fine still stands." The poor man's heart sank. He knew it. The fine was something he just couldn't handle. He could already feel his shoulders slump as the weight of it pressed down on him. But then the judge raised a hand, signaling the man to wait. "I'm not finished," the judge continued. "You say you can't pay the fine, and I believe you. But that doesn't mean you should suffer for it. There's something else to consider here." The man blinked, looking up, confused. What did the judge mean? The room was still, waiting for the judge to speak again. The judge paused, looked around the courtroom for a brief moment, then turned back to the man. He reached for a pen and began writing something on the form in front of him. "I've made my decision," the judge said, breaking the silence. "I'll pay the fine." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The poor man's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the judge in disbelief, unsure if he had heard correctly. The judge looked at him, his face unchanged, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "I'm paying the fine. It's done." The man couldn't move, couldn't process the information. His mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. The judge, this old, respected man, had just said he would pay the fine for him. It was unthinkable. People didn't do that. Judges didn't do that. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. But, Your Honor, I can't ask you to do that. You don't have to." The judge held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not asking. I've already decided. It's the right thing to do." For a moment the room was utterly still. The other people in the courtroom exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. Was this real? Could the judge really be doing this? The poor man's head spun, his eyes filled with tears, but he couldn't find the words to express his gratitude. His heart was racing, his chest tight with emotion. He had come into this courtroom expecting the worst, and now he couldn't even comprehend what was happening. The judge didn't seem to expect any thanks. He simply filled out the paperwork, confirming the decision. The poor man stood there, still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. He had come into this courtroom expecting to be fined, maybe even sentenced to jail. But now the judge had just paid his fine. It was beyond anything he could have imagined. As the judge finished the paperwork and handed it over to the court clerk, the man remained frozen. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was racing. He could barely believe what had just taken place. This wasn't just an act of kindness, it was something far deeper, something he hadn't even known was possible. The courtroom, too, was silent. The murmurs began, but no one spoke too loudly. People exchanged confused glances, wondering if they had heard correctly. Had the judge really just done that? It was unheard of. They'd seen judges make rulings, but never one so personal, so unexpected. The man blinked, fighting back tears. He wanted to say something, to thank the judge for what he had done, but words failed him. How could he express what he was feeling? Gratitude, disbelief, awe, these emotions swirled inside him, but nothing felt big enough to match the weight of what had just happened. As the man left the courtroom, he walked slower than usual, his mind still spinning. He felt like he was floating, as if the ground beneath him wasn't even real. He stepped out into the daylight, blinking in the bright sun, but everything seemed different. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long was suddenly lighter, as if the judge had given him more than just money. The man had been given a chance, something he hadn't had in a long time. The judge sat back in his chair, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He didn't expect any fanfare or praise for his decision. In fact, he never expected anyone to really understand why he'd done what he had. It wasn't something that needed explaining, at least not to most people. But, to the poor man, to those who might question it, he felt the need to share. When the man had left the courtroom, the judge had remained seated, his eyes on the paperwork, his mind far from the case at hand. He thought about how people often saw justice as a simple thing. Rules, fines, punishments. But the judge had learned long ago that life wasn't that black and white. He had grown up poor, just like the man. He had worked long hours, struggled to make ends meet, and felt the sting of being stuck in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. His own family had known hunger, and there were times he had wondered if things would ever change. It was in those difficult years that a stranger had once stepped in to help him, offering him a job when he had nowhere else to turn. That kindness, that simple gesture, had changed his life. It had given him the chance to escape the struggles he had known, to make something of himself. And though the judge had never forgotten the debt he felt to that stranger, he realized now that the true gift had been the second chance he had been given. He couldn't help but believe that sometimes, people needed more than just a punishment. They needed a chance to rise above their circumstances. Sometimes, all it took was someone showing them that they mattered, that they were seen. The judge believed in second chances, and he always had. Not every case was like this one, but this man's story had hit him deeply. He knew what it was like to be at the end of your rope, to feel as though the world had forgotten about you. So when the man stood there, looking so lost and defeated, the judge knew he couldn't let him face that fine alone. He had to do something. It wasn't just about the money. It was about showing the man that there was still kindness in the world, that there was hope, even when it seemed like everything was against you. As the poor man walked away from the courthouse, he felt as though his feet weren't quite touching the ground. The world around him seemed brighter, as if the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long had suddenly disappeared. He kept looking at the paper the judge had signed, the confirmation of the fine being paid. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. His thoughts kept racing. The judge hadn't just helped him with a fine, he had given him something more valuable. The man had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, like no one cared about him or his struggles. But today, in that courtroom, someone had noticed him. Someone had seen his hardship and decided to do something about it. He kept thinking about how much this one act of kindness had changed him. It wasn't just the money, it was the hope it gave him, the belief that things could get better. It reminded him of the days when he was young and still believed that good things could happen to good people. It had been a long time since he'd felt that way. As he walked home, he made a silent promise to himself. He would work even harder. He would take the opportunity the judge had given him and use it to build a better life. He couldn't waste it. It was like a second chance, and he knew how rare that was. He thought of his family, his wife, his children. How would he explain to them what had happened? They had always seen him as someone who could handle anything, but this time, it felt different. The relief in his heart was something he could barely put into words. They would see it in him. They would see the change in his spirit. The man had no way of knowing how his life would turn out. But one thing was clear. Something had shifted inside him. And that shift would be with him for the rest of his life. The judge had given him more than just a way out of a fine. He had given him the chance to believe again, to move forward with hope instead of fear. And that, more than anything, would stay with him forever.